Counter-Narrative News, bringing you daily news today on Monday, the 24th of April 2023. The Chinese ambassador to France, Liu She, has made some interesting comments about the former Soviet Union. He is arguing that the sovereignty of the former Soviet states are in question because he claims, which is totally wrong, that their official recognition of sovereignty is not clear. This has, of course, caused a reaction against some of the Baltic former Soviet states who are pushing back on that, but they are coming at this from quite a right-wing position to themselves. Liu She is arguing that basically Russia has a right to claim Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, because Khrushchev was somehow wrong to give Crimea to Ukraine. Now, the context of Khrushchev doing that is in part the former leader before Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, Stalin, who conducted basically far-right fascist population transfers of whole populations, including the Crimean Tatars. So Khrushchev, in an attempt to repair that injustice, did what he did in relation to Crimea and Ukraine, which is actually a relatively just move. And before Stalin, the other leader of the Soviet Union, Lenin, was a trenchant opponent of the kind of Russian chauvinism that Stalin represented. So you have all of that mess going on. Then you have Mao Ning at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, who says that actually China was really keen to establish full relations with the former states of the Soviet Union. That's not Russia. Now that also reflects another Chinese position. The Chinese position is totally all over the place. It's trying to square the circle of trying to ally closely with the toxic, racist, new colonial leadership, global leadership of Moscow, trying to have relations with the EU, trying to navigate the kind of growing fractious relations with the US, and also trying to see its Chinese own history from the foundation of the modern Chinese state from 1949 with its present situation. So Mao Ning at the Chinese Foreign Ministry says, well, China was keen to establish relations after the fall of the Soviet Union. That represents that Chinese political culture of the Chinese state that was hostile to the Soviet Union, particularly from the early 60s onwards, which the Chinese state considered the Soviet Union the biggest imperialist enemy of all the peoples of the world. But now, because they're in an insecure and an inferior political cultural relationship with the Moscow leadership, they're hugging it closely and trying to use that to protect themselves. But in so doing, they're creating all kinds of political mess. As you can see, the Chinese leadership and state cannot forge a clear policy strategy going forward, and all of this mess is a reflection of that. Going just to tragic news on the Mediterranean Sea once again, the Tunisian Coast Guard has pulled 31 bodies of migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea from the Tunisian coast. This is a really tragic state of affairs, especially considering that these migrants have no political leadership anywhere on the planet. In relation to that as well, in the African context, a quite well-known communist spokesperson from India, Vijay Prashad, I mean, one says he's a communist, but actually he's involved in a lot of right-wing politics, as evidenced by his article recently, which is saying that although President Kagame of Rwanda is falling in line with some Western colonial strategies in Africa, that he is quote-unquote equally also somehow positive because he has some kind of relations or has said some kind of constructive, positive rhetoric about Russia and China in Africa. This is deeply disturbing because Kagame is one of the most toxic pro-Western leaders of Africa, having conducted mass deaths in his neighboring state of the Democratic Republic of Congo by the infiltration of his own M23 death squads. So what on earth is a communist in India doing, trying to spin this bunch of toxic disgustingness as anything positive? The answer is, it's the hegemonic far-right ideas which have deeply infiltrated and saturated that pro-Russian and pro-Chinese quote-unquote left, of what Vijay Prashad is one of the central figures from a leftist posture in this fascist collaborating industry globally. And in the same article, Vijay Prashad is arguing that Russia and China basically has just as much right to exploit Africa, as Western states have done as well. This is just right-wing. This is toxic, pro-colonial, right-wing politics spun as something else. It's just beggars belief that anyone can accept this other than what for the toxic, right-wing, red-brown mess that it is. Going over to some slightly healthier news and positive news, the Minister for Racial Equality, Aniel Franco, has been advocating along with Lula in Portugal for the rights of the Brazilian community there, which stand at 300,000 people, against white supremacist racial discrimination by the Portuguese state. Indeed, out of these 300,000 diaspora Brazilians in Portugal, 98% of them have faced discriminated one way or the other or trying to access their rights vis-a-vis the Portuguese local and national authorities. Aniel Franco, the Minister of Racial Equality from Brazil, is actually the sister of Marielle Franco, who was a grassroots leftist activist and councilwoman who was assassinated by right-wing forces in 2018. Looking at the bigger picture in terms of the oppression, the racist oppression of people in Brazil, the Lula government has won by a threadbare at the election, and all predictions point to the likelihood of the far-right regime of Bolsonaro or a proxy of his returning to power in about 4 years at the next election. In this context, it's important to have strategies that look beyond these. Basically, it's still a colonial infrastructure of so-called democracy and state and nation in Brazil, whereby right-wing pro-colonial racist forces are generally favorable in terms of pursuing their political interests rather than the native, the African Brazilian and the oppressed grassroots who are anti-fascist and anti-racist. The point is that there needs to be long-term strategies at the grassroots to face the racist police terror, for example, in Brazil, the systemic racism that still is in Brazil, and also in support of the diaspora communities around the world, of Brazilians and other global South diaspora, particularly in the colonial centre of the West. For example, in London and in Britain, there's massive communities of Brazilian working class people here. They are largely totally peripheralized and marginalized, have no real political voice, and have very little political movements here. The oppressed global South diaspora communities in Britain need to unite. It's a scandal. It's a ridiculous situation that global South diaspora communities are not uniting around British racism and white supremacy and the British colonial state. This is a central challenge going forward, and one that everyone we would encourage to kind of develop strategic conversations and practice around. Finally, on this day, the Bandung Conference ends in 1955. The Bandung Conference was a historically important conference which, despite many of its contradictions, because as Malcolm X said, you have people of many different political persuasions there in Jakarta, in Indonesia, which hosted the conference by President Sukarno, who was the Indonesian president at the time. You had disparate political forces there, but they were all united around uniting the broad racialized people, the black peoples of the world, as Malcolm X said, towards the black revolution to overthrow colonialism and white supremacy. And if that is the focus, and that must be the focus because that is the global oppressor, colonialism and white supremacy in whatever garbs, east or west, north or south, whatever the kind of posture and the coloration, if it's white supremacy, colonialism, that's the enemy. And if that is focused on as the enemy, the political struggle will develop in a healthier and healthier way going forward. But if we're going to accept the internalization of colonialism and white supremacy by whatever global forces, then things are going to collapse, and that's what we're seeing happening right now and currently. That's Counter-Narrative News. Please continue to support us by liking, commenting and giving us feedback, encouraging your friends and contacts to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we wish you a fantastic day.